Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight we're heading to a quiet little farmhouse in Wisconsin. Nothing fancy, nothing special, just peeling paint, a sagging barn, and a man the neighbors thought was polite enough to babysit their kids. But behind that door, the police were about to stumble into one of the most grotesque crime scenes in American history. If you enjoy falling asleep to true crime nightmares stitched together with sarcasm and candlelight calm, hit that like button, subscribe for more midnight horror lullabies, and drop a comment below. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now on your clock? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Boring True Crime for Sleep, the Ed Gein Files. Let's begin. It was the kind of November day that makes the Midwest feel like the last stop on the edge of the world. The sky hung low and grey. The air was damp, and the cornfields around Plainfield had long since turned into skeletal stalks rattling in the wind. For most of the town, the 16th of November 1957 was just another Saturday. Hardware stores open, hunters checking their rifles, and the inevitable small town gossip over coffee. But for Sheriff's Deputy Frank Warden, it was the day his mother vanished. Bernice Warden had been minding her hardware store that morning, as she had countless times before. She was known in Plainfield as tough, direct, and not easily rattled. That morning, a single sales slip lay on the counter with her handwriting. Antifreeze, Ed Gein. A simple note, but one that would unravel the small town illusion of Plainfield forever. By the time her son went looking for her, Bernice was gone, and streaks of blood told a story no one wanted to read. The investigation moved fast, at least by rural Wisconsin standards. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Everyone in town knew Ed. He was odd, sure, socially awkward, with that perpetual nervous laugh and downcast eyes. But he was also the man who fixed fences, babysat children, and seemed to drift through life as a harmless eccentric. If anything, people pitied him. But now his name was on that sales slip, and the blood in his mother's store demanded answers. By late afternoon, two deputies rolled up the rutted path that led to the Gein farmhouse. If you've ever driven through the back roads of central Wisconsin, you know the type of place. Weather-beaten wood siding, windows so dirty you can't tell if the curtains are closed, or just stained with decades of smoke. The barn leaned like a drunk old man, and the fields around it were more weeds than crops. There was nothing to suggest this was anything more than a poor farmer's neglected property, except the silence. A kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before passing through that farm. The deputies approached the door, boots crunching on frozen dirt. They exchanged a look, the kind you give before opening a door you already regret approaching, and one of them knocked. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The house swallowed the sound like a grave. Finally, they pushed the door open. The smell hit first. It wasn't just the expected staleness of a neglected farmhouse, though that was there in spades. Unwashed laundry, damp wood, dust. No, this was different. A sweetness that curdled into rot, clinging to the throat, making every breath feel like a betrayal of the lungs. Police officers get used to bad smells, dead animals, spoiled food, worse. But this was something else. Something profoundly wrong. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through grime-caked windows. Their flashlights could swathe through the gloom, and that's when they began to see it. A chair with what looked like leather stretched across its seat, only it wasn't the kind of the leather anyone sells in stores. A bowl on the table that seemed carved from bone, and hanging from nails on the wall, faces. Not photographs, not masks you buy at a costume shop. Faces. Human faces. Crudely tanned and flattened like hunting trophies. And then, in the barn, the discovery that would haunt even hardened men for the rest of their lives. The body of Bernice Warden, strung up by her ankles, headless, gutted like a deer. She swung slightly, the chains creaking, as if mocking the intrusion of outsiders into Ed Gein's private kingdom. The deputies staggered back, one retching in the snow outside, the other trying to reconcile the friendly handyman he'd known with the horror dangling before him. This wasn't just murder. This was desecration. This was something out of a nightmare that had crawled into daylight. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Ed was found later that evening at a neighbor's house, calm as ever, sipping coffee like he'd just finished a long day of chores. When confronted, he didn't resist. He simply admitted it. Yes, Bernice was at his farm. Yes, he'd been digging up graves for years. Yes, the masks, the lampshades, the belts, all made from human remains. And just like that, the quiet little handyman of Plainfield became the most infamous name in American true crime. It's worth pausing here, because hindsight has spoiled us. We've all seen Psycho. We've all watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We've heard the name Buffalo Bill whispered with revulsion. But in 1957, none of that existed. There was no cultural blueprint for what Ed Gein had done. The very idea that someone could rob graves, wear the skin of the dead, and live among these grotesque creations was unthinkable. Even hardened journalists struggled to write it down, without sounding like they'd lost their grip on reality. The town of Plainfield recoiled. Some people swore they'd never trusted Ed. Others insisted they couldn't believe it. Ed? Who shoveled their driveways in winter? Ed? Who fixed their roofs? That was the horror of it. He wasn't a snarling stranger lurking in the shadows. He was their neighbor, their friend, their babysitter. The monster had been hiding in plain sight, smiling shyly from beneath his cap. And so, the farmhouse on Plainfield's outskirts was sealed off, every grotesque item catalogued and photographed. Reporters flocked to Wisconsin, hungry for details, their stories dripping with shock and revulsion. The name Ed Gein became shorthand for unspeakable evil, though few yet understood the strange, twisted path that had led him to that barn on that November day. But to understand Ed, to truly see how a boy became this kind of man, you have to step back from the flashing bulbs of police cameras and the sickening evidence lists. You have to go back to the beginning, to the suffocating embrace of his mother, the emptiness of isolation, and the quiet accumulation of obsessions that no one in Plainfield ever noticed until it was far too late. Because before Ed Gein hung a woman like a deer in his barn, before he carved faces into masks, he was just a boy in a farmhouse, told by his mother that the world outside was nothing but sin and corruption. And that, as much as the horrors discovered in 1957, is where the true story begins. The thing about horror is that it rarely announces itself with a trumpet blast. It creeps, it lingers, and then, when you least expect it, it hits you in the gut with a detail you'll never unsee. For the police who first stepped into Ed Gein's farmhouse, that detail could have been any of 100 things. And they didn't stop coming. The first room they cleared looked more like a hunter's cabin than a family home. Except, of course, no hunting lodge in Wisconsin decorates with human remains. On the table, they found a collection of bowls carved from skulls that still bore faint cracks and discolorations, proof that they hadn't been props, hadn't been replicas. They had once contained thoughts, memories, entire lives. Now, they were soup dishes. Nearby sat a chair, its seat carefully upholstered, but not with leather, not with fabric, with skin. Pale, mottled, unmistakably human. Someone had once stretched that flesh across bone and muscle, but now it had been tacked down with upholstery nails to serve a new purpose. It was functional, grotesquely practical, as though Ed had been running a one-man workshop dedicated to violating every taboo human society ever invented. And then the masks. Dozens of them, hung on the wall like grotesque portraits. They were faces, peeled and preserved, eye holes staring out at nothing. Some still had traces of hair, others were dried and leathery. One had been fitted with lipstick, as though Ed had been experimenting with his own macabre brand of makeup artistry. Reporters would later call it his mask collection. But in truth, these weren't collected. They were crafted. This wasn't about trophies. It was about transformation. As the officers moved deeper into the house, their flashlights swept across more unholy creations. A lampshade stitched from skin. A belt studded with nipples like some nightmarish piece of punk rock memorabilia. Boxes filled with organs. A handbag fashioned from flesh. Every corner of the home revealed another piece of evidence that this wasn't a man dabbling in morbidity. This was a lifestyle. In the kitchen, a pot simmered on the stove. Investigators later claimed it contained parts of Bernice Warden. Whether that was entirely true or a rumor amplified by sensational reporting is still debated, but the idea alone was enough to keep hardened deputies awake at night. For decades afterward, locals would whisper about whether Ed had crossed the final line into cannibalism. He always denied it, saying the smell made it impossible. And maybe that's true. Or maybe he simply wasn't willing to admit what he'd done. And then there was the barn. If the house was the workshop, the barn was the slaughterhouse. There hung Bernice Warden, her head missing, her body slit open and gutted like the deer local hunters cleaned every autumn. The parallel was no coincidence. To Ed, the act of field dressing a deer and butchering a human had blurred together into one seamless ritual. The barn was cold, filled with the iron tang of blood. Even the most seasoned investigators, men who'd seen farm accidents and hunting tragedies, struggled to keep their composure. Word of the discoveries spread quickly, and soon the property was swarming with law enforcement, journalists, and horrified locals. People peeked through fences, hoping to catch a glimpse of the farmhouse that had become a portal into hell. Reporters scribbled furiously, describing in lurid detail what police had found. The Plainfield ghoul was born. But amid the hysteria, one fact stood out. Ed Gein wasn't a rampaging serial killer in the traditional sense. He hadn't racked up dozens of fresh victims. Confirmed, there were only 2 murders, Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Warden in 1957. The rest of his gruesome workshop was built from grave robbing. In the dead of night, Ed had prowled local cemeteries, digging up bodies of recently buried women who reminded him of his mother. He would carry them home in the back of his truck, peeling away pieces of them to stitch together into masks, vests, and other grotesque costumes. It's here that Ed's story diverges from the standard true crime narrative, because his obsession wasn't just about killing, it was about becoming. He wanted to slip into the skin of women, literally, and inhabit their bodies. Some have called it an early form of a transgender delusion, though that's an oversimplification at best. What it really was an attempt to resurrect his mother by creating a second skin, a grotesque suit of flesh that would let him crawl back into the comfort of her presence. And this is where the true horror lies. Because while the physical artifacts of Ed's crimes were shocking, it was the psychology behind them that unsettled even the most clinical observers. What kind of loneliness, what kind of warped devotion drives a man to dig up graves, peel away faces, and wear them in front of a cracked mirror? When news of the farmhouse contents hit the press, America recoiled. Photographs from the crime scene were deemed too graphic to release publicly, though a few leaked, and they remain some of the most infamous images in true crime history. The story spread far beyond Wisconsin. Suddenly, Plainfield was infamous, its name forever tied to a man who blurred the line between farmer and monster. For the townspeople, it was almost worse than the horror itself. Ed had been their handyman, their neighbor. He babysat their children, fixed their roofs, cleared their driveways, and all the while, his home was a charnel house. For many, the betrayal cut deeper than the crimes themselves. The farmhouse didn't last long. After the trial and its endless parade of evidence, it was put up for auction. Locals debated what to do with it, some suggesting it could become a macabre tourist attraction. But in March of 1958, before any decision could be made, the farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. To this day, no one knows if it was arson, an accident, or divine intervention. All that's left is a patch of land, silent and unmarked, where once stood the most infamous house in America. Still, the artifacts lived on, some in evidence lockers, some whispered about in hushed tones, and some, inevitably, recreated on the silver screen. Because the horror of Ed Gein's house didn't end when the flames consumed it. If anything, it was just beginning. But the House of Horrors was only half the story. Because while the evidence spoke of graveyards and mutilation, the town itself told a different tale. To most people in Plainfield, Ed wasn't a ghoul. He was the quiet neighbor who fixed a fence, babysat their kids, and laughed nervously when spoken to. The real terror wasn't just what the police found inside his farmhouse. It was the realization that this had been hiding in plain sight, right next door, for years. And that's where we go next, into the uneasy memories of the neighbors, the gossip over diner coffee, and the unsettling truth of how a community managed to live alongside a man building masks out of their dead. If you ask the people of Plainfield what Ed Gein was like before the police stormed his farmhouse, you won't hear about a ghoul or a madman. You'll hear about a man who shoveled driveways in the winter, patched roofs in the spring, and watched their kids when they needed a night out. He wasn't the town drunk, he wasn't violent, and he wasn't skulking through alleyways with a knife. He was just Ed. The quiet, shy bachelor who laughed at the wrong moments and never quite looked you in the eye. This, perhaps, is what made the revelation of his crimes unbearable. Because Ed Gein wasn't some outsider, some shadowy figure that parents warned their children about. He was inside the circle of trust, and that's the kind of betrayal small towns never forget. Neighbors remembered his oddities, of course. He had that strange giggle, a kind of high-pitched chuckle that came at inappropriate times. He avoided women, at least in any normal, romantic sense. When conversations drifted toward dating or marriage, Ed would stare at the floor, embarrassed. Some thought he was simply shy. Others thought his devotion to his mother, even long after she died, had stunted him. A few, with hindsight sharpened by horror, swore they'd always known something was off. But let's be honest, people say that about every criminal after the fact. In truth, most saw him as trustworthy. He babysat local kids without incident. He did chores around town. He rarely lost his temper. If anything, people pitied him. His clothes were shabby, his farm falling into disrepair. He seemed lonely. And Plainfield, being the sort of place where everyone knows everyone's business, extended him a kind of collective tolerance. That's just Ed, they'd say, shrugging off his quirks the way you shrug off a leaky faucet. A nuisance, sure, but nothing dangerous. Yet behind that awkward smile and polite exterior lay an obsession that turned graveyards into hunting grounds. He was the handyman of Plainfield by day and a nocturnal ghoul by night. But no one saw it because Ed didn't fit the mold of a monster. And maybe that's the most chilling part. Take the story of the venison Ed was known to bring neighbors packages of meat, claiming it was deer he had hunted. Rural folks share food. It's a way of life. And who would turn down free venison in a town where winter lasted half the year? Later, when his crimes came to light, whispers spread. Had those packages been deer at all? Or something else entirely? Police never proved cannibalism, and Ed himself denied it. But that didn't stop the rumor mill from churning. For years after, Plainfield residents would eye any leftover meat in their freezer with suspicion. And then there was his role in the local school system. No, he wasn't a teacher, don't panic, but he was considered reliable enough to babysit children. Parents who had left their little ones in his care later wrestled with the unbearable thought. He sat in our living rooms, drank our coffee, and watched cartoons with our kids, all while human faces hung in his own house like wallpaper. Of course, small towns have long memories, and after 1957, every quirk of Ed's personality became, in retrospect, a red flag. That odd giggle, proof of madness. His solitary lifestyle, a cover for grave robbing, his shabby clothes, evidence of his obsession with wearing other people's skin. Memory, after all, is a malleable thing. When horror crashes into ordinary life, people rewrite their own history to make sense of it. But at the time, before the arrest, none of it raised alarms. The fact is, Ed Gein didn't just live in Plainfield, he blended into it. He was a part of the scenery, like the peeling paint on Main Street, or the rusting tractors sinking into fields. He was too boring to be dangerous, too ordinary to be feared, and that ordinariness was his camouflage. The irony is that Ed himself wasn't particularly good at hiding his strangeness. He'd make macabre jokes at the bar, once quipping that he had Mary Hogan out at the farm right now. Everyone laughed, assuming it was just the local oddball being weird. When it turned out to be true, no one was laughing anymore. In hindsight, those offhand remarks look like confessions hiding in plain sight. But hindsight is cruel that way. It turns ignorance into guilt. When the truth broke, Plainfield residents were forced to reevaluate every interaction they'd ever had with him. The man who mended their fences was also dismembering corpses. The neighbor who babysat their kids was also stitching belts out of human skin. And the quiet bachelor they pitied had been prowling their cemeteries under cover of night, desecrating the graves of their loved ones. The betrayal cut deep. In big cities, crime can be compartmentalized. It happens out there to someone else, in some dangerous neighborhood you never visit. But in Plainfield, Ed Gein wasn't out there. He was everywhere. He was in their homes, their stores, their churches, and that realization spread like a poison through the community. Even decades later, Plainfield never recovered. Tourists came, of course. Macabre curiosity seekers who wanted to see where the infamous Gein had lived. Locals resented them, resented the intrusion, resented the fact that their quiet town's name had become synonymous with unspeakable horror. Some insisted they'd never forgiven themselves for not seeing it sooner. Others claimed they'd always suspected. But the truth is simpler and far more disturbing. There was nothing obvious to suspect. Ed Gein looked like a nobody, and that's exactly why he got away with everything for so long. By the time the farmhouse was reduced to ashes in 1958, whether by accident or arson, Plainfield residents sighed in relief. At least the cursed building was gone, but the memory lingered, heavier than smoke, woven into every conversation at the diner, every glance at the cemetery gates, every awkward silence when outsiders asked about that Gein fellow. Because the farmhouse may have burned, but the neighborly betrayal never did. And so, while the neighbors pieced together their memories with shame and disbelief, investigators turned their focus further back in time. To understand how Ed Gein became the man who could sit in your kitchen by day and skin a corpse by night, you had to look at the soil he grew in. His childhood, his family, and above all, the iron grip of his mother. That's where the trail leads next, into the suffocating walls of the Gein farmhouse, long before the blood and the masks, when Augusta still ruled her sons with fire and brimstone sermons, and little Eddie learned that the world outside was nothing but sin waiting to devour him. To understand how Ed Gein became the man with faces on his wall and bones on his table, you have to rewind the clock. Long before the farmhouse reeked of rot, long before Plainfield whispered about cannibalism and graveyards, there was just a boy named Edward Theodore Gein. Born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, not exactly a hotbed of culture, his world was shaped less by the land around him and more by the two deeply flawed adults who claimed him. Let's start with George, the father. George Philip Gein was a man destined to fail at almost everything. He drifted between jobs, carpenter, tanner, insurance salesman, and never held on to any of them for long. Alcohol was his closest friend. To young Ed, his father wasn't a role model so much as a warning sign. This is what weakness looks like. Drunk, unemployed, perpetually defeated. By the time Ed was old enough to form memories, George had already checked out of being a father. And then there was Augusta. Oh, Augusta. If Ed ever had a god, she was it. Born into a strict Lutheran family herself, Augusta decided early on that the entire world was rotten. Everyone was corrupt, everyone was sinful, and women, other women, not her, were the root of it all. Sex was dirty, desire was damnation, and her sons? They would be her disciples, living proof that she could raise pure men in a filthy world. She moved the family from La Crosse to a remote farm in Plainfield, far from the temptations of city life. That wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a quarantine. She wanted to control every word her boys heard, every friend they might make, every possibility of contamination by the outside world. Social life was banned. Play was trivial. The Bible was the only acceptable reading material, unless it was her fiery monologues about women as instruments of the devil. Ed absorbed it all. He wasn't rebellious. He wasn't a fighter. He listened. He obeyed. He let her words settle into him until they weren't just rules. They were truth. And when he did go to school, he stuck out immediately. He was shy, quiet, often muttering to himself. His eye had a congenital defect, a lazy lid that gave him an odd, lopsided stare, and children, being merciless creatures, teased him relentlessly. He never fought back. He simply endured it, returning home to his mother, who told him he was better than the rest anyway. Isolation became his second skin. While other boys hunted, fished, and courted girls, Ed busied himself with chores, reading macabre adventure stories, and worshipping at the altar of Augusta. His father's drunken collapses meant little to him. It was his mother's approval that mattered. She was the law of his universe, the voice that told him how the world worked. To disobey her was to invite damnation. To obey her was to remain safe. And then there was Henry, the older brother. Henry was stronger, sharper, and eventually skeptical. He saw Augusta's grip on Ed for what it was. Suffocating, manipulative, dangerous. He tried to steer Ed away, tried to puncture the bubble. He mocked Augusta's endless sermons, told Ed that maybe she wasn't as holy as she pretended. And Ed? He hated it. He couldn't bear hearing his mother's name in vain. For Ed, Augusta was beyond criticism. She was untouchable. Henry's doubts and Ed's devotion would eventually collide in tragic fashion. But that comes later. For now, the important thing is this. Ed grew up in an environment where the outside world was framed as hostile, dirty, and doomed. His mother's voice told him that women were wicked and that sex was a sin. His father's failures showed him what happened when a man wasn't strong enough to resist temptation. And his brother's rebellion proved that doubt could only lead to ruin. The farm itself was bleak. Hundreds of acres, yet strangely barren of warmth. The house was drafty, poorly lit, and filled not with laughter, but with Augusta's fire and brimstone tirades. There were no sleepovers, no games with friends, no teenage crushes. There was only the family, or more accurately, the mother. Even as a teenager, Ed never dated, never pursued anyone. He stayed home, clung to Augusta, listened to her passages from the Old Testament about sin, lust, and damnation. If you're starting to see how this boy became the man with faces on his wall, you're not wrong. And yet, here's the thing. People who knew Ed as a child didn't describe him as cruel. He wasn't the kid who killed cats behind the barn or picked fights on the schoolyard. He was odd, yes, but not violent. If anything, he was compliant, quiet, unthreatening, which makes what came later even harder to digest, because Ed's darkness didn't explode outward the way it does in most killers. It folded inward, quietly fermenting until it had nowhere else to go. The irony, of course, is that Augusta thought she was saving him. By walling him off from temptation, by shaming every flicker of desire, she believed she was raising a holy son. What she was really doing was constructing a psychological cage, locking Ed inside with only her voice echoing off the walls. When she died years later, Ed was left alone in that cage. And without her, he tried to fill the void in the only way he knew, by stitching together new skins to step into, new masks to wear, new mothers to resurrect. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, imagine the boy on that bleak farm, trudging through chores with downcast eyes, clutching his school books while classmates mocked him, returning home to a mother who assured him that everyone else was corrupt and he was special. This is the soil that grew Plainfield's ghoul. Not sudden, not explosive, just slow, steady rot, nurtured under the watchful gaze of a mother who believed she was saving her son from sin. And in doing so, planted the seeds of something far darker. The neighbours, of course, saw almost none of this. To them, Ed was shy but polite, maybe a little odd. They didn't hear Augusta's tirades, didn't see the way Ed flinched when his brother criticised her, didn't witness the suffocating devotion that bound him to his mother. They only saw the shell, not the storm brewing inside. And as Ed grew older, the walls of that cage only tightened. His world was shrinking, but his inner obsessions were expanding. It was only a matter of time before those obsessions found their outlet. And when they did, it would begin with tragedy close to home. Because every monster has an origin story, and for Ed Gein, The next chapter wasn't written in scripture or sermons. It was written in fire, smoke, and the suspicious death of the only person who ever challenged Augusta's reign, his brother Henry. By the mid-1940s, life on the Gein farm had narrowed into a routine that was equal parts bleak and suffocating. George Gein, the alcoholic father, had long since checked out the story. He died in 1940, his liver finally surrendering to the bottle. For most families, a death would shift the household dynamic. But in the Gein house, George's absence was more like a shrug from the universe. He had been a presence without influence, a man who haunted the background with slurred words and shaky steps. His passing left Augusta as the absolute ruler of her domain, with her sons Henry and Edward as her unwilling congregation. Henry, the elder brother, had grown tired of it. He was practical, sturdier in body and mind than Ed. He saw the world differently. While Augusta thundered about the sins of mankind, Henry quietly rolled his eyes. He wanted something beyond the endless chores and sermons. Most damning of all, he sometimes spoke openly against their mother. He told Ed that Augusta wasn't a saint, that her iron grip was poison. To Henry, Ed's devotion was unhealthy. To Ed, Henry's skepticism was blasphemy. And then came the fire. It was May 1944. The brothers were out burning marshland on the property, a common farming practice at the time, used to clear brush and stimulate new growth. But fire is a fickle tool. What began as controlled quickly slipped loose. Flames licked across the dry grass, wind whipping them into something unmanageable. The two men scrambled to contain it, smoke curling into the spring sky. Neighbors later reported seeing the column of smoke rising over the Gein farm. When the fire finally died down, only one brother returned. Ed told the authorities he had lost track of Henry in the smoke. Searchers combed the area, and it was Ed himself who led them straight to the body, as if he'd known exactly where to look all along. Henry lay face down in the dirt. Officially, the cause of death was asphyxiation, smoke inhalation, a tragic accident, easily explained by the chaos of a grass fire. But the body told a stranger story. His head bore bruises, suspicious for a man supposedly killed by smoke. His clothes were scorched, yes, but his body itself wasn't badly burned. It was as though the fire had been incidental. Whispers started almost immediately. Did Ed kill his brother? Had a lifetime of resentment boiled over into violence that day, out in the smoke and flames? Some theorized that Henry had confronted Ed about his slavish devotion to Augusta, that an argument turned physical, and Ed snapped. Others imagined something even darker, that Henry had become the first casualty of Ed's obsessions, an early, clumsy attempt at silencing anyone who challenged the sacred bond between him and his mother. We'll never know for certain. No autopsy was performed. The coroner, perhaps eager to move on, stamped the paperwork with accidental death and closed the book. In 1944, Plainfield wasn't the sort of place that hunted for scandal. Fires killed men. That was enough of an explanation. But to the retrospective eye, Henry's death feels like a hinge. With him gone, Ed was left entirely alone with Augusta. No more challenges, no more skeptical voices. Just mother and son, locked in their insular orbit. Ed, the obedient child, now had no counterbalance. And Augusta, whose health was already faltering, leaned even harder on him. The irony is cruel. Henry may have been the one person capable of pulling Ed out of Augusta's suffocating gravity, but his sudden death only tightened her control. Ed no longer had to defend her sermons to anyone. The farm grew quieter, more desolate, more claustrophobic. It became the stage for the final act of Augusta's reign, and, later, the birthplace of Ed's descent into the grotesque. Neighbors, of course, chalked it up to bad luck. Fires kill people every year in rural Wisconsin. Why question it? Yet some never forgot the odd details. Ed's calm demeanor when he discovered the body, the strange bruises, the way he seemed almost detached from grief. In the years after his arrest, many looked back and decided they had seen it all along. That Henry's death wasn't an accident, but a foreshadowing. And perhaps it was. Whether or not Ed laid hands on his brother that day, Henry's death removed the last buffer between Ed and his mother. Augusta had her favourite son all to herself. And Ed? He had the only relationship that ever truly mattered to him. Unchallenged, unshared. But fate, or biology, had other plans. Augusta was not immortal, no matter how loudly she railed against the sins of others. The fire had claimed Henry, but Augusta's own body was beginning to betray her. Strokes weakened her, left her frail, dependent. For Ed, this was a paradox. The woman who had towered over his life, who had dictated every thought and action, was now vulnerable. He nursed her dutifully, tending to her every need. And when she died a year later, in 1945, Ed was left stranded. Stranded not in the literal sense. He still had the farm, the land, the chores, but spiritually, emotionally, he was adrift. The one anchor of his existence, the one voice he had trusted above all others, was gone. And without her, the cage she had built around his mind remained. But it was empty, echoing, unbearable. What does a man do when the only voice he trusts falls silent? In Ed's case, he went looking for a way to bring it back. But before we step into the bleak aftermath of Augusta's death, we linger one last time on Henry's body, sprawled in the dirt in May 1944. Whether it was accident or murder, the result was the same. The last thread tying Ed to normalcy was cut. And from here on, there was nothing to stop him from slipping deeper into the grotesque logic that would one day horrify the world. Next came grief, obsession, and a farmhouse that would slowly transform from a family home into a mausoleum. If there was ever a moment that split Ed Gein's life into before and after, it came in December 1945, when Augusta Wilhelmina Gein, his mother, finally died. She was 67 years old, felled by a series of strokes that first left her weakened and then, ultimately, silent. For most men, the death of a parent is a painful milestone. For Ed, it was the collapse of his entire universe. To understand why, you have to remember what Augusta was to him. She wasn't just mother. She was judge, jury, priest, and savior. Her sermons against the evils of the world had shaped every corner of Ed's imagination. Women were harlots. Sex was sin. The outside world was a trap. She was the only pure soul he believed existed. And now, she was gone. Ed nursed her during her final days. Neighbors later recalled seeing him shuffle into town, haggard, but utterly devoted to her care. When she died, something in him seemed to collapse inward. He didn't rage. He didn't weep in public. He simply withdrew. The farm became his sanctuary, and his prison all at once. He boarded up the rooms Augusta had used, locking them away like relics. Her bedroom, the parlour, the sitting room, all sealed. Dust collected, curtains sagged, but Ed never touched them. It was as though he had entombed her within the house, creating a shrine to her absence. The rest of the farmhouse decayed around him, He confined himself mostly to the kitchen and a small side room, while the other spaces fell into squalor. Newspapers piled up. Trash littered the floor, and the air grew thick with neglect. But the real change wasn't in the walls of the house. It was inside Ed himself. Without Augusta's voice to guide him, he was lost. Her moral compass had been extreme, but it had been a compass nonetheless. Now there was only silence, and Ed's own mind filled the void with obsessions. He lingered in cemeteries, drawn to the earth that held women who reminded him of his mother. He read pulp magazines about cannibals, headhunters, and Nazi atrocities, absorbing grotesque stories as if they were instruction manuals. Loneliness gnawed at him. He tried to fill it in strange ways. He listened to radio programs late into the night. He leafed through anatomy books. He became fascinated with stories of women who had lived lives far from Augusta's puritanical vision. Prostitutes, tavern owners, women who drank and swore and laughed too loudly. They disgusted him, but they also drew him in, like moths to flame. This paradox defined him. Augusta had taught him to despise women, yet he yearned for them. He wanted to feel close to them, even if only by taking their skin and slipping it over his own body. It was less about sex and more about possession, about capturing what he thought he had lost with Augusta's death. The neighbors noticed changes, though not enough to raise alarms. They saw the farm falling into disrepair. They saw Ed's clothes grow shabbier, his laughter more nervous, his eyes more distant. They pitied him, the lonely bachelor still mourning his mother. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Ed was still part of the background noise, odd but harmless. No one imagined what he was doing when the sun went down and the cemeteries grew quiet. Because here's the part that makes the story shift from tragic to monstrous. Ed didn't just mourn. He acted. He began robbing graves. Freshly buried women, preferably middle-aged, preferably resembling Augusta in stature. He dug them up, carried them home, and dismembered them. Skin became masks. Skulls became bowls. Flesh became upholstery. Each act was an attempt to bridge the gap between his crushing loneliness and the impossible standard of purity Augusta had left behind. If you're looking for the origin point of the woman suit that would inspire decades of horror films, this is it. Alone in his farmhouse, Ed stitched together fragments of other people's bodies in an attempt to resurrect the only relationship he had ever known. It wasn't about power. It wasn't even primarily about killing, at least not at first. It was about filling the silence Augusta had left. His descent didn't happen overnight. Years passed between her death and his eventual arrest. During that time, Ed lived a double life. To the town, he was still the odd but harmless handyman. To himself, he was a craftsman of nightmares, piecing together a grotesque second skin to crawl into. And yet, even amid the horror, there was something almost pathetic about him. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't cunning. He didn't stalk the streets with a blade. He was small, meek, socially inept, a man-child who never left home, who clung to his mother's memory so tightly that when she died, he tried to build her out of corpses. It's almost worse than imagining a sadistic killer, because it forces you to see the banality of it. A lonely man, a broken man, who turned his grief into grotesque craftwork. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Ed's obsessions had hardened into rituals. He raided graves. He experimented with masks. He decorated his home with the remnants of the dead. And yet, he still walked the streets of Plainfield, chatted awkwardly with neighbors, and babysat their children. For Plainfield, The Gein farm became a symbol of decay, though no one yet knew how literal that decay was. The house sagged. The land went untended. Ed seemed to drift, neither fully alive nor fully gone, haunting the margins of town life. And behind the boarded-up rooms of the farmhouse, behind the shrine to Augusta, the true Ed Gein was emerging. Augusta's death had broken him, but it had also freed him. With no one left to enforce the rules, Ed built his own twisted morality, one grave at a time. And soon, graves would not be enough. If Plainfield's townsfolk had ever asked themselves what Ed Gein did at night, most would have guessed something pitifully ordinary. Reading magazines, tinkering with broken farm tools, maybe listening to his radio until he dozed off. No one imagined him in the cemeteries, shovel in hand, moving quietly under the cover of darkness like a man on a mission. Yet that's exactly where he went. Again and again. Searching not for peace, but for company. The cemeteries around Plainfield were small, scattered across the rural landscape, their headstones leaning with age, their iron gates rusting. For most of the town, they were sacred ground, quiet places to lay flowers, to whisper prayers, to keep grief contained. For Ed, they were hardware stores of the macabre, stocked with the raw materials he believed he needed. He admitted later that he would enter a kind of trance when the urge struck him. Sometimes he claimed he'd wake from it, unsure how he even got to the graveyard. But the truth was, he knew exactly what he was doing. He waited until burials were fresh, when the soil was still loose. He preferred women, middle-aged, heavy-set, resembling Augusta. He dug with a methodical patience, lifted the coffin lids, and carried away what he wanted. Sometimes entire bodies, sometimes only pieces. He was disturbingly efficient. He knew how to avoid notice, how to time his excursions so no one would catch him. He often went in the dead of night, moonlight glinting off his shovel as he moved earth with the kind of persistence only obsession can fuel. The thought of him trudging through the Wisconsin cold, breath fogging in the air, is almost as unsettling as what he carried home afterward. And home is where the transformation happened. His farmhouse became a laboratory of grotesque invention. A breastplate fashioned from female torsos, which he could strap to his chest. Masks made from the carefully peeled skin of women's faces, preserved and hung on the wall like a collection. A full woman suit, stitched together, which he admitted to wearing in private moments. Not for costume parties, of course, but as a way of becoming his mother, or at least a woman like her. It wasn't all ritual and fantasy. Ed had practical uses too, at least in his own twisted logic. Skulls became bowls, flesh became upholstery, bones became ornaments. His farmhouse was no longer a home, it was part graveyard, part workshop, part shrine. Each grotesque object carried a piece of someone else's story, stolen and repurposed in Ed's attempt to fill the void Augusta had left. And here's where the rumors begin to blur with the facts. Locals whispered for years about missing people, particularly women, whose disappearances were never solved. Evelyn Hartley, a teenage babysitter abducted in La Crosse in 1953, was one of the names that swirled in gossip. Officially, no evidence tied Ed to her case, but the speculation persisted. After all, if he was grave robbing in one part of Wisconsin, who's to say he wasn't hunting in another? The police only ever confirmed 2 murders, Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Warden in 1957. But the sheer scale of remains in his house suggested more than just those 2. Parts from dozens of different women were catalogued. Some matched exhumed graves. Others didn't. Even today, The true body count of Ed Gein is uncertain. Some say he never killed beyond the 2 confirmed. Others believe there were more, far more hidden beneath his calm admissions and his bizarre denials. One of the eeriest details of his confessions was the way he described these cemetery trips. He didn't speak with the frenzy of a killer or the thrill of a hunter. He spoke with a craftsman's detachment, almost as though he were describing a trip to the hardware store. I went out, got what I needed, brought it back, worked on it. That was the rhythm of his nights. To him, these were errands. To the rest of us, they were desecrations so profound, they collapsed the line between tragedy and nightmare. The people of Plainfield didn't know, of course. By day, Ed was still the quiet handyman, chuckling nervously in the diner, helping out on odd jobs. Parents still left their children with him. He was the man you pitied, not feared. The ghoul in the graveyard was invisible to them. And here's the terrible irony. Cemeteries, meant to protect the memory of the dead, offered no defense against Ed. The fences, the headstones, the prayers, none of it mattered when a man with a shovel and an obsession decided the dead belonged to him. He wasn't robbing graves for money or valuables. He was robbing them for identity, for company, for the raw materials to build a surrogate mother out of stolen flesh. In another time, another place, maybe Ed's compulsions would have been noticed sooner. Maybe someone would have seen the decay of the farmhouse, the smell that clung to his clothes, the distant look in his eyes, and realized something was wrong. But in Plainfield, Ed was just Ed, and cemeteries are quiet places. The dead don't tell secrets, and the living didn't want to ask questions. Looking back, it's tempting to see his grave robbing as the peak of his depravity. But in truth, it was only the rehearsal. Because eventually, exhuming bodies wasn't enough. Eventually, Ed would decide that waiting for women to die naturally was too slow, too limiting. Eventually, he would look at the living and see not neighbors or acquaintances, but future materials. The graveyards had given him practice. The farmhouse had given him a workshop. All that was left was for Ed Gein to take the next step. One that would move him from ghoul to murderer, from gravedigger to legend. And that step came in 1954, when a Plainfield tavern owner named Mary Hogan disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a blood-stained floor and a community baffled by her sudden absence. For years, Ed Gein had managed to keep his obsessions tucked safely beneath the soil of Plainfield's graveyards. The dead were his resource, his silent accomplices. They didn't fight back, didn't scream, didn't leave witnesses. It was grotesque, yes, but it was also, in its own nightmarish way, sustainable. But something changed in 1954. Maybe the cemeteries no longer gave him what he needed. Maybe his fantasies had grown bolder. Or maybe loneliness finally tipped him into action. Whatever the reason, that year Ed stopped waiting for people to die. The first confirmed victim was Mary Hogan. Mary was, in almost every way, Augusta's worst nightmare given flesh. She was brash, loud, foul-mouthed, and unapologetically sexual. She ran a tavern in Plainfield, and her sharp tongue was legendary. Where Augusta preached purity and restraint, Mary embodied the opposite. A woman who smoked, swore, laughed too loudly, and didn't particularly care what anyone thought of her. In other words, the very kind of woman Augusta had warned Ed against his entire life. And yet, Ed was drawn to her. Perhaps precisely because she was everything Augusta despised. On a snowy evening in December 1954, Mary Hogan vanished. Her tavern was empty when neighbors came by, but there were bloodstains on the floor and an empty cartridge from a .32 caliber pistol. No body, no sign of struggle beyond the blood. Just absence. Plainfield shrugged it off with nervous speculation. Maybe she'd run off. Maybe she'd gotten into trouble elsewhere. But the truth was far darker, and it lay just outside of town in Ed Gein's farmhouse. Years later, when police searched his home after Bernice Warden's disappearance, they found Mary. Or rather, they found parts of her. Her head, preserved in a paper bag. Her remains scattered among the other grotesque creations. The most chilling part? Ed had practically confessed years earlier, in plain sight. Sitting at the local tavern, he once joked to other patrons that he had Mary out at the farm right now. Everyone laughed, assuming it was the awkward, inappropriate humor of the town oddball. But Ed wasn't joking. He was telling the truth, disguised as a punchline, and no one thought to check. If Mary's murder was the rehearsal, Bernice Warden's was the full performance. Bernice wasn't like Mary. She wasn't brash or vulgar. She was a widow, respectable, the kind of woman Augusta might have tolerated. She ran the local hardware store, and on November 16th, 1957, she went to work as usual. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, planned to stop by later. By afternoon, she was gone. The store showed signs of struggle. Bloodstains marked the floor. And the last receipt in the cash register told the story. Antifreeze, sold to Ed Gein. By then, Plainfield already viewed Ed as strange, but harmless. Frank Warden did not. With his mother missing, the receipt in hand, and the farm calling his name, he and other officers drove out to confront Ed. What they found, as we've already seen, would unravel the fabric of their town. Bernice's body hung in the barn, decapitated, gutted like a deer. Her head was found in a burlap sack. The farmhouse was filled with horrors collected over years of grave robbing, and supplemented now with fresh murder. It was no longer possible to pretend that Ed was just the quiet neighbor. He was the ghoul of Plainfield, a monster stitched together from grief, obsession, and blood. And here's where the contrast stings. Ed never hunted for sport. He never taunted police, never wrote manifestos, never strutted like a predator. He killed quietly, clumsily, as though murder was simply the next step in a progression he could no longer control. He wasn't chasing thrills. He was filling a void. The irony is brutal. Mary Hogan, with her loud mouth and barroom swagger, was everything Augusta despised. Killing her was, in some twisted way, Ed's attempt to silence temptation. Bernice Warden, respectable and maternal, was closer to the ideal Augusta had hammered into him. Killing her was an act of preservation, taking her body, disassembling it, and making her part of his shrine. One woman punished for being what Augusta hated, another stolen for being what Augusta approved. Either way, Augusta's ghost hovered over both murders. When the truth came out, Plainfield reeled. The whispers about missing women suddenly had a face. The odd behavior, the strange jokes, the packages of venison Ed had gifted to neighbors. All of it turned sinister in hindsight. Parents who had left their children in his care now shuddered. Women who had spoken to him across counters or in the diner remembered the way his eyes lingered and felt sick. For investigators, the murders confirmed what the house had already suggested. Ed wasn't just a grave robber. He was a killer. Whether Mary and Bernice were his only victims remains an open question. Some argue he killed more and simply never admitted it. Others insist his meekness and clumsiness kept him from becoming a prolific murderer. But the fact remains. 2 women entered Plainfield's orbit, and ended up as trophies in Ed Gein's farmhouse. 2 deaths were enough to secure his place in history, and 2 were enough to inspire nightmares that would echo far beyond Wisconsin, feeding the imaginations of Hollywood writers who turned him into Norman Bates, Buffalo Bill, and Leatherface. But back in 1957, in the small town where everyone knew his name, the murders didn't feel like the beginning of a horror franchise. They felt like betrayal, like violation, like the shattering of the fragile safety small towns cling to. Because if Ed Gein could kill Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, what else was he capable of? And had Plainfield ignored the signs all along? Those were the questions buzzing through the town as police dragged Ed away. His thin frame swallowed in an oversized coat, his eyes downcast, his voice soft. Not the look of a monster, just the look of a man caught in the middle of chores. When the cuffs closed around Ed Gein's wrists in November 1957, it was less like arresting a criminal mastermind and more like leading away a bewildered farmhand who had misplaced his tools. He didn't fight. He didn't snarl. He didn't even seem particularly worried. He just admitted things calmly, like a man checking items off a grocery list. Yes, I killed her. Yes, I dug up graves. Yes, I made masks. His tone unnerved investigators more than the words themselves. Monsters were supposed to roar. Ed spoke like he was describing a recipe. The legal machinery churned into motion. But from the beginning, one question loomed larger than all the others. Was Ed Gein insane? The evidence was overwhelming. Rooms filled with human remains, confessions that left no ambiguity, but his demeanor complicated everything. He wasn't cunning, wasn't violent in the traditional sense. He was polite, deferential, even timid. When questioned, he sometimes giggled, a nervous tick that made his words even more disturbing. How do you process a man calmly admitting that he wore other people's skin like clothing, punctuated by a childlike chuckle? Psychiatrists descended on Plainfield like moths to a flame. To them, Ed was a living case study, a man whose brain seemed to straddle the line between delusion and reality. They diagnosed him with schizophrenia, necrophilia, and psychosis. But even those labels felt inadequate. He wasn't sexually aroused by corpses in the way classic necrophiles were. He admitted to cutting up bodies, to wearing them, to sleeping with them nearby. But when asked about intercourse, he denied it. They smelled too bad, he explained, as though that were the only obstacle. It was a denial that chilled doctors and prosecutors alike. If smell had been the deterrent, then what exactly would have stopped him otherwise? Then there was the infamous woman suit Ed confessed that he had stitched together torsos and breasts into a kind of vest, with masks to match. He admitted to wearing them at night, pacing through his decaying farmhouse, pretending to be his mother. He didn't describe it with shame or anger. He described it with a matter-of-fact detachment, as though trying on another person's skin was simply something you did when loneliness gnawed too hard. At first, prosecutors considered charging him with multiple murders, but the psychiatric evaluations made it clear. The trial would be less about guilt and more about sanity. In January 1958, Ed was formally charged with 1 count of first-degree murder for Bernice Warden. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and the court agreed. After a brief hearing, he was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. There, Ed became something of an odd celebrity. Guards and doctors noted his quiet demeanor. He was cooperative, even helpful. He worked in the hospital kitchens, sweeping floors and scrubbing dishes. The man who had horrified the world with his museum of death was, in daily life, the model patient. He didn't cause trouble, he didn't lash out. He giggled, read adventure stories, and seemed almost normal. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of all. But the legal story didn't end there. A decade later, in 1968, the courts decided to retry Ed's sanity. Times had changed, forensic psychiatry had advanced, and the state wanted closure. This time, Ed was found competent to stand trial. The proceedings were brief but sensational. Witnesses described the barn where Bernice was found, the artifacts catalogued in the farmhouse, the endless list of grotesque creations. Ed sat through it all, calm, detached, occasionally smiling at odd moments. His defense rested on his insanity, but the court found him guilty of Bernice Warden's murder. Yet, in a twist of legal irony, he was still declared insane and unfit for prison. So back he went, this time to Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he would spend the rest of his life. What fascinated psychiatrists then, and still fascinates criminologists today, was the combination of Ed's meek exterior and his horrific interior life. He wasn't a sadist in the traditional sense. He didn't kill to watch people suffer. He killed because he wanted to possess. He wanted to reconstruct. He wanted to create a substitute for the only relationship he had ever truly valued. To many, that made him even more terrifying. Sadists can be understood. Obsessives can be categorized. But Ed existed in a murky in-between, where pathology blended with grief, and where horror emerged not from rage but from longing. In later interviews, Ed sometimes expressed remorse, not in the way most killers do, with tears or apologies, but with a kind of vague regret that things hadn't worked out differently. He once told investigators that he knew grave robbing was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. He said it like a man admitting to a sweet tooth. He seemed almost baffled by his own compulsions, unable to explain them, yet unwilling to fully deny them. The trial and its aftermath sealed his reputation. The newspapers dubbed him the Plainfield ghoul. Psychologists dissected his every word. Journalists mined his story for lurid detail. Hollywood soon followed, turning Ed into a cultural archetype. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. All of them trace their roots back to Ed Gein, sitting quietly in a courtroom, giggling under his breath while prosecutors read out lists of human remains found in his kitchen. And Plainfield? Plainfield never shook free. For years, townsfolk avoided speaking his name. Outsiders came asking for directions to the farmhouse that no longer existed. Locals shook their heads and muttered, "Burned down." Nothing to see. But they knew there was always something to see. In memory, in rumor, in shame. The trial may have ended, but the legacy of betrayal lingered in every diner booth and every cemetery gate. Ed himself seemed oblivious to the scale of it all. To him, the trial was just another series of questions. The world might see him as a monster, but Ed saw himself as unlucky. A man who loved his mother too much, who got carried away, who didn't really mean harm. That was the paradox of Ed Gein. The man who turned corpses into furniture still thought of himself as harmless. And perhaps that's the ultimate horror. Not the blood, not the masks, not the belt of nipples catalogued in court, but the quiet conviction of a man who never truly understood why everyone else was so disturbed. Because if he couldn't understand it, who's to say it couldn't happen again? By the time the 1980s rolled around, Ed Gein had been out of sight for decades. Locked away at Mendota Mental Health Institute, He lived the quiet, compliant existence that had always been his camouflage. No more graveyards, no more barns, no more faces hanging on walls, just routine, meals, chores, therapy sessions, the endless shuffle of institutional life. If you'd walked through the halls of Mendota in those years, you might have mistaken him for a janitor or a patient who kept to himself. The Plainfield ghoul had been reduced to a frail man in state-issued clothes, his horrors preserved only in photographs and whispers. On July 26th, 1984, Ed Gein died of complications from cancer and respiratory failure. He was 77 years old. For a man who had defined himself through death, his own passing was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No cameras in the hospital room, no grand confessions. Just another patient in a ward full of forgotten souls, taking his last breath. And yet, outside those walls, his name still reverberated. His body was returned to Plainfield and buried beside his mother in the family plot. That detail alone felt like a final, twisted joke. Augusta, the woman whose sermons had created the psychological cage Ed never escaped, now lay eternally next to the son who tried to resurrect her with the flesh of other women. The cemetery workers lowered his coffin into the soil, and for a brief moment, Plainfield's infamous son returned to the ground he had disturbed so many times before. But death didn't silence Ed Gein. If anything, it amplified him. Tourists flocked to the cemetery. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others out of genuine fascination, still others to vandalize. His gravestone was repeatedly chipped away by collectors looking for souvenirs. Eventually, it was stolen outright in 2000, later recovered in Seattle of all places. Today, his grave is unmarked, though everyone in town knows where it lies. And Hollywood? Hollywood feasted on him. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho premiered in 1960, just 3 years after Ed's arrest, and Norman Bates was born. A shy, awkward man with a suffocating devotion to his mother, keeping her corpse in the house and speaking to her as though she still lived. It was a thinly veiled retelling of Ed's psychology, dressed up with Hitchcock's flair for suspense. Audiences gasped, critics raved, and Ed Gein's shadow stretched from Wisconsin cornfields to the silver screen. Then came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. Leatherface, stumbling through his decrepit farmhouse, chainsaw roaring, human skin mask strapped to his face. That was Ed, refracted through the lens of grindhouse horror. The bone furniture, the skin lampshades, the meat hooks in the barn, straight from the evidence lists of the Plainfield farmhouse. The movie exaggerated, yes, but the bones of it, pun intended, were Gein's. And in 1991, The Silence of the Lambs gave us Buffalo Bill, a man obsessed with transformation, stitching together a woman suit from the skin of his victims. Hollywood had circled back to Ed's darkest fantasy, giving it a new, horrifying spin for a modern audience. Even Hannibal Lecter, with his grotesque mixture of politeness and monstrosity, echoed Ed's unsettling combination of meekness and horror. If you trace the genealogy of American horror, it all comes back to Plainfield. The small, odd man with the nervous giggle became the DNA of an entire genre. Every time Leatherface revs his chainsaw, every time Norman Bates smiles at the camera, every time Buffalo Bill whispers, it rubs the lotion on its skin, Ed Gein's ghost is there, stitched into the fabric of popular culture. But beyond the movies, beyond the myths, there's the town of Plainfield. For them, the legacy was less cinematic and more suffocating. Imagine living in a place where your identity is forever tied to one man's crimes, where outsiders show up asking for directions to the Gein farm, long since burned to the ground. where your cemetery becomes a tourist attraction, your town's name synonymous with unspeakable horror. For Plainfield, there was no escape. Ed Gein became their brand, and it was a brand of shame. Some locals embraced it grudgingly, selling souvenirs, capitalizing on the notoriety. Others despised it, refusing to speak his name, insisting that Plainfield had been unfairly cursed by history. But the stain remained. And what of Ed himself? Those who worked with him in Mendota remembered him as quiet, polite, helpful. He tended the gardens, did chores, never caused trouble. If you met him there, you might never guess his past. And maybe that's the most unsettling legacy of all. The man who had horrified the world with his farmhouse of horrors could, in another context, seem harmless, almost forgettable. The monster and the nobody were the same person. That contradiction is why Ed Gein endures. He wasn't the prolific killer with a body count stretching into the dozens. He wasn't the charismatic predator luring victims with charm. He was something far stranger, far more ordinary. A shy farm boy who loved his mother too much, who couldn't let go, and who tried to stitch her back together out of the bodies of strangers. It forces an uncomfortable question. How many other Ed Geins are out there? Not chainsaw-wielding maniacs, not Hollywood monsters, but quiet, lonely figures whose obsessions fester in silence, unnoticed by their neighbors until one day they spill into the world. In the end, Ed Gein didn't just give us nightmares. He gave us a mirror, a reminder that horror doesn't always announce itself with blood and rage. Sometimes it wears overalls, fixes your fence, and giggles awkwardly at the diner. Sometimes the monster is the man next door. And when he dies, quietly, in a hospital bed, the monster doesn't vanish. He lingers, in stories, in films, in whispered rumors over cups of coffee. Ed Gein will never leave Plainfield. He'll never leave Wisconsin. He'll never leave us. Because once you've seen the face of horror stitched together from the faces of neighbors, you don't forget it. And that sleepless rabble was the tale of Ed Gein. A quiet farm boy, a grieving son, and the man who unwittingly gave Hollywood its most famous monsters. From Norman Bates to Leatherface, from Buffalo Bill to every horror cliché stitched in celluloid, his shadow stretches far longer than the cornfields of Wisconsin ever did. If you made it this far, congratulations. You now know more about nipple belts, skin lampshades, and barnyard taxidermy than any sane person should before bedtime. Sweet dreams. If you enjoyed this little midnight stroll through America's most grotesque farmhouse, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more sleep stories soaked in sarcasm and dread, and drop me a comment below. Which horror movie character do you think captured Ed Gein best? Norman Bates? Leatherface? Or maybe Buffalo Bill? I'm curious what creeps into your mind when you picture him. This is Napmax Sleep Stories. And you've just been listening to boring true crime for sleep, the Ed Gein Files. Now go get some rest. Because unlike Plainfield in the 1950s, you're safe. Probably.